Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda, 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 Namanda. Shi Shin Please join me in reading the Three Treasures 1. Hard is it to be born into human life. Now we are living it. Difficult is it to hear the teachings of the Blessed One. Now we hear it. If we do not realize the truth in this life, then when will it be realized? Let us reverently take refuge in the three treasures of the truth. I take refuge in the Buddha. May we absorb ourselves in the principle of the way to enlightenment and awaken in ourselves the supreme will. I take refuge in the Dharma. May we be submerged in the depths of the doctrine and gain wisdom as deep as the ocean. I take refuge in the Sangha. May we live in harmony in the great assembly as disciples of Buddha and be freed from all hindrances, becoming units of true accord in a life of harmony, in a spirit of universal oneness, freed from the bondage of selfishness. Even through myriad ages of kalpas, hard is it to hear such an excellent, profound, and wonderful doctrine. Now we are able to hear and receive it. Let us thoroughly understand the true meaning of Tathagata's teaching. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda, 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 Namanda. We will now chant Juseige. Go 願不満足政府上昇が我無良好不意大摂取不再小便具政府上昇がが市場分動妙正長実法空境未小門政府上昇学利欲人少年上映主本業しぐ無浄土一生天人し心力現代公不償無才道症状三苦名交際集約難会知恵言熱し根門案閉塞小悪道通達全宗門高層超満足異様実法日願修十期天空普現一種解放像公正空読法上大集中説法ししく不要一切分具足中悪法願下心上満即位三害を女仏無下地通達未不詳願学営利投資最小損志願や効果大戦の感動国書天人東宇珍妙見ナマンダブナマンダブナマンダブナマンダブナマンダブナマンダブ願にしく読平等性一切老本菩提心往生ナモアミダ仏ナモアミダ仏ナモアミダ仏ナマンダナマンダナマンダナマンダナマンダナマンダ We'll now listen to the Gatha Metta. Thank you for coming to this morning's service. I'd like to start the Dharma message portion of the service. If you'd please join me in Kansho, I'd like to share a passage with you. I've collected true words so that they may help others practice the way for birth. For my wish is that those who have attained birth may lead those who come after them, and those who aspired for birth may follow their predecessors, thus following one another endlessly and uninterruptedly until the boundless sea of birth and death is exhausted. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda, Namanda. The passage I just shared is from Tao Cho's collections of passages on the land of peace and bliss. And this passage expresses an aspiration of the highest compassion, that is work to exhaust the very waters of the ocean of samsara, of birth and death, of our suffering. That the teachings that we find for ourselves and share with others will lead those other people and ourselves to the end of suffering, person by person, until all suffering in the world is eliminated. Pure Land Master Tao Cho lived in China at a time when Buddhist persecution was very prevalent in the region where he lived. Over 1 million monks and nuns were laicized during his lifetime, and they lose their very livelihoods. You see, in order to join a monastery, one has to give up everything that they own and much of what they have connecting them to the outside world. So to be laicized is to be sent out onto the streets without anything. This time was a time of intense war, famine, and disease. And yet Tao Cho and many other Buddhists found great hope in the Pure Land teachings of the Nembutsu, or taking refuge in the Buddha of measureless life and limitless wisdom and compassion. Also, if we look back in the times of Shinran and Honen in Japan, similarly, it was a time of great political upheaval. There were lots of wars, natural disasters, and personal persecution of Pure Land Buddhists by the government. This led to exile of many of these Buddhists and the execution of some of the followers of Honen. Rather than giving up, however, they found hope and a new life in the Pure Land teachings and in taking refuge in the Buddha of immeasurable light and life. And this led them to become great teachers, without whom we would not be here today. I'd like to think about these great teachers and the history of our tradition and think about their lives and the words that they've shared with us and wonder, what do we do in times of trouble as Buddhists? How can the teachings sustain us as they did our teachers? We may come to temple, or these days we'll participate in online services for a few hours out of the week, but what about the rest of the week? What's our personal practice? We may chant, we may say Namo Amida Butsu, the Nembutsu. We may offer incense and Oshoko before the Buddha, but what about outside of those settings? What do we do every day in our lives? When we're at work, when we're at school, at the gym or the grocery store, a lot of those things aren't accessible these days. So sometimes we're stuck at home a lot. And so sometimes we have to think about, how can we look to our teachings to find ways of being more happy in our everyday lives and finding contentment in some of the suffering that we face. I'm not suggesting that our words or actions could be perfect, but I'd like for us to think a lot more of the big picture in our lives and what we do to support a more wholesome view on life. That is, we should ask ourselves the question, in times of crisis and in joy and the mundanity of daily existence, how do we direct our lives as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists? And I'd like to shift gears here for a moment to look at these questions from a different perspective. Theologian James Fowler came up with an idea of understanding the purpose in life in his questions of faith. He said that the questions he developed helps us to get in touch with the dynamic patterned process by which we find life meaningful. And I'd like to look at my own personal take on these questions. The first question that Fowler asks is, what are you spending and being spent for? What commands and receives your best time and your best energy? This is a good question, and I struggle with it every day. Early on, after I'd started attending Berkeley Buddhist Temple, I was helping with our community outreach team, and I led a group of volunteers to help out at Project Homeless Connect in San Francisco. This organization helps to offer services to poor and unhoused people in San Francisco. And so at this particular event, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I was serving as a guide. And so many participants would line up and then come into the building and go through a greeting process where we would register them and help them to sign up for the services they needed, such as immediate medical care, acquiring food, looking for assistance with finding housing, and many other services offered by the city. During this time, I met a lot of wonderful people. One of those people was James, and I spent about 45 minutes with him, even though usually most people I just spent about 5 or 10. As me and James got to know one another, he told me that he had studied Buddhism in Japan, China, and Korea for several years. He asked me what I do, and at the time I was a manager at a retail store in San Francisco. And so I told him a little bit about that. But he pressed, what do you do here? And so I told him I was guiding and helping people find what they need when they come into Project Homeless Connect. And so he said, wow, you're a guide. You know, that's what the Buddha did. I was really touched by what James had to say to me. And after a time, I realized that all of that work that I had invested in corporate retail was unfulfilling, and that I needed to follow in the footsteps of Buddha and so many of his followers. All of the masters throughout the centuries, down to Shinran and the ministers in the Buddhist churches of America. This was a life-changing moment for me. And it was all because of 45 minutes spent with James and me really digging deeply and reflecting on what I'm devoted to in life. The second question from James Fowler's Questions of Faith is, what causes, dreams, goals, or institutions are you pouring yourself out for? That is, what are we investing our lives in? As I was a student at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, sometimes I saw my work there as a chore. And I'd often ask myself why I was there. I was there to become a minister, to live a life of service, and to fulfill my personal aspiration to help others. And so when I came back to that centralized grounding idea of being a minister and helping and leading others through service, I found my studies rejuvenating, and it gave me a stronger sense of purpose in my studies. When I started school, I was recovering from a knee injury, and I'd had an invasive surgery there, and it was required for me to go through about 2 months of rehabilitation where I could barely move, and then several months of physical therapy. So it was hard for me to get around, but I'd still make my trip from Alameda, where I was living at the time, to the Institute of Buddhist Studies, and it took about 45 minutes on a bus. One day after class, when I was heading to physical therapy in Oakland, about 30 minutes away, I was bringing a book with me to read on the bus because that's a good time to study. I was a bit frustrated in one of my classes about thinking about Buddhist terminology and concepts and worldviews. A lot of these ideas were foreign to me and confusing, and I'm sure I still feel that way a lot of the time, and maybe many of you do as well. You see, in my undergrad, I was academically trained as a scientist in geology, and so talking about metaphysics was something that was a bit different for me, and I wasn't really comfortable with it. However, on this bus trip to physical therapy, I saw an interesting looking guy and sat near him on the bus while I was reading. He was probably unhoused as he wore messy clothes and he was wearing a necklace, well, several necklaces. One of them had a crystal in it, and he was sitting there talking to himself. So I sat down near him and was reading, and he looked up at me. And sometimes it's a little bit scary, I guess, being in a public space where there's lots of different people with different needs that aren't being met. However, I decided that I would look back at him, and we started a conversation. He had commented on the Amida tattoo I have on my arm, right here. He said, "I like your tattoo. You must be a holy man." I laughed at myself and shrugged my shoulders and said, "No, not really. I'm not very holy." He said, "I think you are. See, you're reading that book." And he pointed at the book I was reading, which also had an image of Amida Buddha on its cover. So after a while, we talked, and he started to share with me that he also had injured his knee when he had served in the military, and that experience had changed his life. He also told me he was very happy that I was able to get treatment and hopefully I would recover well. So we talked for about 10 or 15 minutes, sharing these stories. And as I got up to leave, he told me to hold on. And he took off the necklace, the one with the crystal in it, and gave it to me. And then he put his hands together in Kansho. And he said, "Thank you for talking to me." He said the necklace was special and made out of real crystals. So I thanked him and I got off the bus and immediately proceeded to cry my eyes out. This man had recognized within me what I had initially disregarded in him, and that's our shared sacredness. This experience reminded me of why I was in school and my desire to help my community. It was humbling because here I was, a graduate student going to school. Luckily, I'd been supported by scholarships, but at the same time, that's not an opportunity that many others are afforded. And yet, this man who was living on the streets was able to touch my heart and my life in a way that 4 years of school couldn't. This helped me to see more direction in my life and to think a bigger picture of where I'm going, what I'm doing, and how I see myself in the world. As we consider to think of the questions of faith by James Fowler, I'd like to talk about the next one, which is, as you live your life, what powers or power do you fear or dread? And what power or powers do you rely on and trust? For me, I fear and dread the nasty bits of humanity that cause great anguish, the discrimination, racism, hatred, oppression, violence, and fear that we're all prone to. These are powerful forces, and they cause a lot of suffering. But powerful too are the forces of compassion, kindness, and love. These are the powers that I rely on and trust. And I think that if we look carefully at our lives, we can find sustaining forces of compassion that maybe don't mean a lot to us at the time, or perhaps they do, but they're what get us through the day. Like that conversation with the man on the bus, or my conversation with James. Those are turning points in our lives. And so if we can find that power of compassion in our lives, then maybe we can make it through. The next question from James Fowler is, to what or whom are you committed in life, in death? I'm dedicated to those who feel the pain of suffering, and that's all of us, but especially the oppressed and those whose voices are drowned out by marginalization, hatred, and violence. I don't know what will happen when I die, which makes me all more committed to those in life. The next question is, with whom or what group do you share your most sacred and private hopes for your life and for the lives of those you love? I share my hopes and dreams with my friends, my family, and my Sangha, as I'm doing today. And I hope for the lessened suffering of all those beings, that we find our purpose in life, goals, and love, that we're able to make it through difficult times and rely on one another. We can rely on our faith and our tradition and those who love us to help us get through hard times. The last question is, what are your most sacred hopes, those most compelling goals and purposes in your life? My hope for myself is that every day and in every moment, I can bear witness to people's lives and encourage them so that they can live in freedom and happiness and share that sense of liberation and joy with others. I want the world to be a better place for all of us, not just a few. And I think this is a really important part of our faith as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, is that we realize that all life is worthy of compassion. That's the wisdom of the teachings, that all of us are equally held by Amida's wisdom and compassion. As I read through and answer these questions for myself, I see the importance of living a life with intent. There are times in our lives filled with darkness, of pain, isolation, or even just being bored, especially during these times of this pandemic where we're often stuck at home with not many people to talk to and be around. The idea that I haven't had a hug in probably 7 or 8 months is really sad to me because I like hugs. And that's a dark feeling. And those times of not having a hug, not having someone to hold hands with or just to express myself with, I lose sight of that aspiration of how the world can be much brighter and hopeful for all of us. Just as Tao Cho aspired to end the suffering of all beings, so too did Honen and Shinran, the founders of our tradition, and also countless other brave and compassionate teachers through the ages. They likely had times of failure, of darkness, and of frustration, but they held true to their wish, their prayer to teach others in order to help them find the cure to their suffering. I'm a foolish being, limited by my karma, and I'm doing my best to understand my own limitations, but I still hold on to the aspiration and intent in my heart and mind to always guide. Though we face darkness, frustration, confusion, and sometimes insurmountable evils in the world, my wish is all around the idea that we are all worthy of love and compassion, and that's what guides me back to my aspiration. If you please join me with Ingasho, I'd like to close today's Dharma message with a quote from Shinran Shonin. My eyes being hindered by blind passion, I cannot perceive the light that grasps me. Yet the great compassion, without tyrant, illumines me always. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Naman love, naman love, naman love. Thank you for coming to today's Dharma message. I hope you have a great week.